All right. Good afternoon, all, and welcome to BookHampton and RJ Julia Booksellers virtual event featuring author Honor Moore, who today will be in conversation with the wonderful Ellen Chesler. We are so excited for today's discussion, but just a few quick Zoom housekeeping details before we jump in. Please ask questions using the chat box function of your Zoom screen. We're going to get to as many of your questions as we can later in the discussion, and even though you'll be muted throughout the duration of the event, we do have a BookHampton staff member that's monitoring the chat box. So all and any questions that you have, put them in that chat box and send them on over. We'll get to them later on. For optimal viewing, use the Zoom view functions in the top right corner of your screen and select speaker view. That way the speaking author will remain highlighted throughout the duration of your event. And of course, don't forget to purchase a copy of Our Revolution. Links for book purchases will be sent to you in the Zoom chat box, and signed book plates from Honor Moore are available while supplies last. So get your copy while you can. Now for the fun part. We are so absolutely thrilled to be hosting this event today with author Honor Moore and the wonderful Ellen Chesler, who today join us to discuss Honor's new book, Our Revolution. Honor is the author of 2 previous memoirs, The Bishop's Daughter, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and The White Blackbird, a New York Times notable book, as well as 3 collections of poems. She has been a poet in residence at Wesleyan University and the University of Richmond, visiting professor at the Columbia School of the Arts, and 3 times a visiting distinguished writer in the nonfiction writing program at the University of Iowa. She lives in New York City. In conversation today, we have Ellen Chesler, who is a senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, where she focuses on women's rights and reproductive health in the US and abroad. Ellen is the author of the critically celebrated Women of Valor and has written numerous essays and articles for academic anthologies and for prominent newspapers, journals, periodicals, and blogs. She holds a BA from Vassar College and a PhD in history from Columbia University. Without further ado, we're going to share with you a 90-second video introduction. Please enjoy it, and welcome to Honor Moore and Ellen Chesler.
Okay, such beautiful people. It's such a pleasure and privilege for me to be here with my friend Honor Moore. We met more than 3 decades ago in a women's biography seminar at NYU. We were both writing about Margarets. We had a lot in common, although they couldn't have been more different. I should say also, just this will amuse Honor, that we had a women's biography seminar because a group of us got tired of listening to very long-winded men talking about the misogynistic men they were writing about. I do remember particularly Saul Bellow. I recently tried to reread Bellow. I can say for sure that the one outcome of the second wave feminism that this book engages, that I can be sure of, is that Saul Bellow today would never win a Nobel Prize for Literature. Enchanted by Honor's writings ever since. If you can bear with me, I confess that I often am guilty of judging a book by its, not its cover, but its first page. And I've never read a better first page than in this memoir. It captivated me from absolutely the start, and I couldn't put the book down after. So, I've often told Honor that she should have been a novelist. She's such a great stylist, but with characters like the ones in her family, have to write fiction. She could never make anyone up quite as vivid as they are. So let's start just to give you a sense of not only the story, but also the style of this book by having Honor just read that first beginning.
Okay. Prologue, a bequest. It was a catastrophe, her sudden death, a break in that stream of birthday celebrations and Christmases, disruption of the ever-renewing sequence of photographs, little girls in bright-colored coats, little boys in red overalls, photo-ready smiles, with her, with our father. She would get home first with us, not standing with him at the church door as people left, as he shook their hands or embraced them. Or maybe she hadn't gone to the morning service, had gone only to midnight mass the night before, waited till we were all in bed, then filled the stockings, eaten Santa's cookies, leaving crumbs, and later, as they sat with friends drinking and laughing, asked someone please to drink half Santa's glass of milk. The stockings were nylon, the ones with runs she saved for the purpose. She wrapped every present in bright tissue and put it in a stocking so that all she had to do was replace the empties hung from the mantelpiece with the full ones she had been stuffing for weeks. Eventually, there were 9 of us, but her diligence did not waver. Sometime after I reached my teens, she began to use pantyhose. Is that her I see now, walking across the meadow outside my window, the ground-length white coat, white hair, chin raised, winter sun at her face? And then her face turns toward me. Dark blue eyes, the look that contains all I do not know. It's the Christmas I am 67, and I am leafing through photographs, her letters, the unfinished writing she left me in her will. Or it is a Christmas in the early 1950s, and I am coming down the stairs, maybe 6 years old, and she is standing there dancing, singing, I saw Mommy kissing Santa Claus underneath the mistletoe last night. If she were alive now, she would be almost 90. The low December sun has settled on the winter yellow of the meadow in the New Hampshire studio where I'm writing. The pines are green, dulled to black, and spattered close to me at the foot of a stone wall is what remains of the snow. Through the pines, another building. In a photograph of her taken at a party some years before the accident, she wears a sleeveless white brocade sheath, quite short since it's 1971, is standing in the corner of the room at a party, her smile ablaze. Yes, her death was a catastrophe, each of her children thrown into individual sorrow into our lives, now without the attentiveness of her companionship. She bought a blue suede dress to wear when she visited President Kennedy. When he was killed, she passed the dress on to me, and it was stolen from the college costume shop where I had taken it to be altered. I'm sorry, they said, as if what I had lost was only a dress. There is a woman in white coming toward me along the narrow road. She is taller than I am, and she has black hair. I can't make out her face. These past days, that word catastrophe, and in my imagination, a blank of forgetfulness. The woman in white walking toward me on the winter road. The woman dancing at the foot of the stairs Christmas morning. The woman in white glistening in the corner of a room at a party. Her black hair tangling on the white pillow of a deathbed.
Poignant and tragic. She died just at 50, is it?
50, yeah.
You were how old?
I was 27, and when I started working on this book, one of the things was I had written about her when I was in my 20s, and so I thought, oh, I've already written about her. But then I thought, she's 50. I'm like, by the time I get around to the book, 70. I could be her mother. So it was this interesting flipping of roles, which I kind of...
Her death, however tragic, was also empowering for you because she bequeathed you her writings. So encouraged you to find your own voice as a writer. You've done so writing about her mother, the painter Margaret Sargent, and about your father, but it's taken almost 50 years to really fulfill her intent that you also use some of her legacy. Let's talk about her in happier times and give our audience a sense of her extraordinary life. Paint a portrait of Jenny McKean, child of a privileged New England family, but not any ordinary one, since her own mother, the painter Margaret Sanger, was a gifted...
Sargent.
Margaret.
You said Sanger.
Oh, I'm sorry, Margaret. Yes, I did, Sargent. You can see I can't put Margaret without Sanger together. Margaret Sargent. A gifted but troubled painter, and not a great mom.
Right.
A little bit about this childhood and this milieu from which...
Well, my mother, one of the most moving little passages she wrote in this memoir she began on her deathbed. She had published a book in 1968, so she was a writer by the time she became terminally ill. And the book had been very successful. And so she's on her deathbed and she's writing this memoir, and she writes, whenever things became upsetting at home, which they did, because Margaret was not only bipolar, as we would say now, but drank to medicate herself. And she and her husband, my grandfather, fought. So my mother would say, I love to go out on my horse with my dog. And she talks about a kind of solitude. So, and interestingly, in many pictures that I have of her with the family, she's always the one looking away or standing at a slight distance. The other thing she did to stand out was to become, they all rode horses and showed dogs. So she became quite the horseback rider, show champion, winning 3 blue ribbons when she was 10, and at 14 winning the Diana Cup. I love that it's the Diana, the goddess Diana Cup in the ladies' race, and everybody else was in their 20s and 30s. So she was quite a champion, and she became a competitor. She had that energy.
This is the 1930s, obviously a time of depression and civil and social unrest in the United States, but she has this very privileged background as a result of...
sheltered, yeah.
Yes, grandfather's good fortune, and also inherited wealth. She goes off to college just as World War II is beginning. Talk a little bit about that, just because it's such a beautiful part of the book. And what you do so well, Honor, is not only the intimate parts of the book, but you place your mother in the social and historical context of the times, and you draw a portrait of that world that's really totally engrossing.
Well, I was sort of, first of all, she was the first woman in her female lineage to go to college. My grandmother's sister, for instance, was accepted to Radcliffe and didn't go because she got married instead. But And my mother had a great desire to go to college. So first she went to Madeira, which was a boarding school, which was a very academic and good boarding school. And then she went to Vassar, which was a kind of, people from Madeira went to Vassar. The woman who started Madeira had gone to Vassar. And she gets to Vassar, and and I didn't know this. I mean, I started looking in the college newspaper, and it was a hotbed in a way. I mean, I knew that there had been Edna St. Vincent Millay and Elizabeth Bishop and Mary McCarthy. I did not know that people like Angelica Balabanov, who had been in Lenin's inner circle, came through there to promote her memoirs. Here I am promoting my memoirs. And so it was, and Muriel Rukeyser had been a graduate, and Muriel Rukeyser gave a reading. And so it was quite eye-opening for my mother. And then what happened is really interesting. She went home to the family house, and she got this hysterical blindness. I mean, she was going to go back to Vassar, but suddenly she couldn't see. Now, there are no medical records and so on, but I did some research, and including a couple of women that I knew who actually had this happen right at that moment of moving into adulthood. In any case, she did recover. She started exchanging letters at that point with my father, whom she had known. They'd been in the same group of friends. And then after a year volunteering at at Mass General, as what was then called a candy striper, she went to Barnard, where it seemed that many young women in her sort of group wanted to be in New York. They wanted to be together during the war. And many of them went to Barnard, another really interesting place. And my mother, in her first semester, I always wondered, how did she get interested in race? Because my father is known as the great civil rights guy, but it was my mother who sort of exposed him to that part of, life. And I found, researching the Barnard catalog, that she took this anthropology course with a disciple of Franz Boas, whose other disciples were, Ruth Benedict and Zora Neale Hurston and Margaret Mead. And the first subject, we will discuss subjects, race. So race was part of her college education. And that's where she began to be interested. And at the same time,
a whole new world and enter
a whole new world. Yeah.
A whole new world. Let me ask you to move quite quickly, because we have such limited time and we want to questions. I mean, for those of you in the audience who are interested in this period, many of us may have mothers or grandmothers of the same ilk. Honor's rendering of it is just rich and fascinating. She did enormous amounts of research. I mean, there's a reason this book took as long as it did to gestate, because in addition to her own beautiful writing, she became a historian and did a great deal of research in order to tell the story, way beyond using her mother's own writings from the period, which she weaves in beautifully to her own narrative. Let's get to Paul Moore. You call their courtship an epistolary
courtship. Yeah, they
can't say the word.
He came back from Guadalcanal. He almost died at Guadalcanal. He came back to New York to recuperate and sort of pitch, sort of work for the recruiting office of the Marines. He was a kind of hero. And he and my father were sort of in the same general group of friends, and they started to go out. And the first night that they went out, they went to this Russian cafe downtown, 14th Street, and touched each other's hands and, fell in love. So they dated for, this 3 months. And then he had a choice between going to teach recruits in Seattle or New Haven. And he chose Seattle, and she was furious and devastated. So that was their first breakup. But what happened was they kind of sneaked back into writing letters. And then,
which you were able to use as source material for
which I found after my father's death, these boxes of these meticulously organized letters. And then, each of the 9 children has a copy of these letters, copies of these letters. So I had used them in The Bishop's Daughter, but I got so deeply involved with them here, because what she does is she tells the story of the home front because she's telling him what's going on at home among their friends, who's getting married, who's not getting married, who can't get out of bed after the week after their wedding, who got a sapphire ring from Australia, and what's going on at school, and so on and so forth. And so they go back and forth. Then she goes out there with her mother as a chaperone to quote unquote visit her brother, and they break up again. They do not measure up to each other's expectations. And she's furious. And but then an interesting thing happens, which is that he's already had a conversion experience in his teens. And he says things to her like, you should go to church, it would do you good. So she does that and goes to the priest that it was sort of my father's spiritual advisor, and has her own conversion experience, somewhat different. But I think that the church and that talking about religion was access to their inner lives.
Your father, like your mother, comes from an extremely privileged family in New Jersey, goes to Harvard, and
Yale, yeah.
World though it's a world where people never talk about their own feelings, and
right,
austere, so any kind of emotion isn't expressed. And in these letters, you find that they have an ability to communicate that is unusual, certainly for their this time period and social class. Anything more you want to say about that?
Well, I want to say that enabled them to sort of, that having a spiritual life enabled them to talk seriously to each other. And so that's when they became a team, and they started to have dreams together. And she even says, darling, I hope you get a small, poor parish where we can help a lot of people. And, my father wasn't thinking about but that's what happened. So it's very interesting.
So early in their marriage, let's just a little bit run through the narrative, and then we can't do the entire life in a few minutes, but tell us about where your childhood begins, where you enter the picture most consciously, which is on 2nd Street in Newark. In
Jersey City, yeah.
Jersey City,
They decided they had done some work with street kids during seminary, and they decided they wanted to go to that kind of parish. 2 priests and my father and my mother. And my mother was an official member of the team. She wasn't just the wife, even though she was official member of the team, she did the cooking and all that.
And 9 children.
And by the time we left Jersey City, there were 7. So I say in the book that I just thought our house would expand, just keep expanding. But it was a kind of community center. The church became a kind of community center, and it became a gathering place for poor people in a multiracial, very vivid and vibrant community of mostly Black people from the community, many of whom had come to work on the waterfront or in factories. And I went back to Jersey City I've been back several times, but I went back and talked to this 95-year-old woman who had known my mother, and she said, yeah, she'd show up with a baby under one arm and a cabbage in the other, you know, which is, she was both.
So,
Go ahead.
well, so again, to cue the reader, the listeners, I mean, what is extraordinary is the range of social and political issues that these lives engage.
Right.
This very cloistered New England world, and to the streets of Jersey City, on to Washington, where Paul Moore becomes bishop of the National Cathedral, and then back to New York.
And Indianapolis in between, which at the time was a very racist city. Yeah.
So it's a tableau of America in the 1950s and 1960s, but through the prism of an unusual and complicated family. And obviously one that gave rise to an extraordinarily gifted writer. So they were very lucky in their progeny in that respect. The marriage, though, was unconventional in so many respects. I mean, it was, you know, a pronatalist time in American history, and people of the social class particularly began to have 4 and 6 children. Why did your mother have 9?
Well, it's very odd, because that's the question people always ask. And I thought, how am I going to deal with this in the book? And first of all, I thought she was a competitor. So it's the baby boom. Everybody's having 4, 5, 6 children. I'm going to have 9. So it's like the, you know.
Would she call it a baseball team or a small orchestra?
Or a small orchestra. And then the next thing is that I think that while they loved each other a great deal, my father was secretly bisexual, and you know, they both told me it's in the category of TMI, but both told me that they weren't a sexual fit. So I do think that the children were a kind of consistent sort of desire to manifest their love in some new form each time another child was born. And also, I think that, I can't remember what else I was going to say. Well, the other thing I want to say, because Ellen is the interlocutor, is that I once ran into Alex Sanger, who is the grandson of Margaret Sanger, and he said, well, I guess your mother didn't pay too much attention to my grandmother. And I said, au contraire, they were members in good standing of Planned Parenthood, and they timed us. And I don't remember in the video, there's that kind of chart with yellow highlighting and turquoise highlighter. And that's my pregnancy chart. And it's, you know, it's pretty much every 2 years. And it was actually, people were amused. One of the columnists in Indianapolis said, I just don't understand Paul Moore. I mean, you know, he's a member of Planned Parenthood, and they're about to give birth to number 8.
Just for 2 minutes, so that we don't make your father the center of this story, since he's not the center of this book, but you in The Bishop's Daughter, which was nominated for a National Book Critics Circle Award and highly celebrated, outed your father. Sexuality wasn't known beyond his family at the time. That was—
Well, that's not exactly true. I mean, first of all, I don't think you can out the dead. So outing implies a kind of violence. I did tell the truth about his life. And this was a truth that my mother sort of put together before she died, and they separated, but she never confronted him with it, and she never told any of us. There were a few people around who knew about it, but it was and by the time he died, it was one of those things you call an open secret, but it was by no means public. It's just that I couldn't really, I had to work out this life of my father, this man who had been my father, who wouldn't talk to me about this part of his life, which I understand, but at the time I was very frustrated by it. And it's an interesting thing that happens writing these books. I mean, I initially was very angry at my father, and I came to love him. I rediscovered my love for him in the process of writing the book. And with my mother, we had sort of come to we'd had a lot of fights when I was a teenager, and it was like, and we had kind of come to a truce. And I used to think that I made that up somehow, but actually I have it all on paper. I have the letters. So we did kind of come to a truce. And so the loss of my mother was that we didn't get to have that time together. I mean, we read Ms. together for, a year, and then she was gone. So I always felt this extraordinary.
What's beautiful, though, about your portrait of this marriage is that you show how complicated marriages are, even though he had this confusion about his sexuality. I think we could call it a confusion. I mean, it was far more typical for men who had some preference on same-sex relationships to have them in a closeted way, and often to marry and carry on parallel lives as marriages, not just after she died. But their intimacy transcended all of that because, as you point out, she was a kind of truth teller, and he, this child from a very repressed background with this deep secret, could confide in her, even if not
entirely.
It is beautifully rendered in your book, and a portrait of a marriage that I think will go down as one of the great classics. But I want to also, because my training is as a historian, although I did write one biography, I worked most of my life in public policy, not even as an academic historian. I want to talk a little bit about the other markers in second wave feminism of your mother's life, beyond Margaret Sanger, Betty Friedan. Talk about that and how she made the transition after being the bishop's wife and 9 children, and trying to perhaps
do something else.
Sorrows.
She was
a professional woman of quite, I remember the publication of her book. I was in college.
Yeah, well, it was, interestingly, Betty, the Feminine Mystique came out in February 1963. In January 1964, the family moved from and she read it, and she told everybody to read it. She would call up her friends and she said, "Oh, there's this book. You've got to read it."
Loved hearing this.
And then they moved to Washington. Kennedy was shot. They moved to Washington. Literally, the summer of 64. Well, the summer of 64. Let's see. Let me get this right. No, the summer of 63. She starts writing the book, and then when she gets to Washington and gets more or less settled, she asks a new neighbor across the street who goes to work and all the kids are in school and so on, if she can use her empty dining room. And she proceeds to write the book starting in the spring of 1964, and it's published in 1968. I mean, it's really something. And I used to think, how did this happen? She
a major book in the civil rights conversation and revolution. Explain a little just about the way.
Well, it was a memoir of Jersey City, and it was
on 2nd Street.
It was called The People on 2nd Street, and it was a memoir of the years in Jersey City, and it's very self-interrogating about her and their integrity and authenticity in taking on that work when they could leave the neighborhood, but that the people they served could not. And that theme sort of animates the book. And so it's a very important document in a way, because it's really about somebody struggling to be what we would now call an anti-racist. At the time it was, you believed in integration.
But when you returned many years later, people remembered her with such love as their friend.
Well, I assumed, of
and as
course,
somebody who opened up to them, even though she came from a different world, and subsequently went on to meet with Kennedys and
right,
and McCarthy,
right,
McCarthy, and become the friends of the most powerful and elite in Washington. We're running out of time, so I just want to end because you are a major part of this book, and your life as a feminist and as a writer is also beautifully rendered in its last pages. And you call the book Our Revolution. Why that title? And what are the meanings of that title?
I had always, not all of you know, but those of you who are writers know you sort of give chapters names, even if they don't end up being the title that you end up with. And the last chapter was always called Revolution and Return or something. And then I decided I was just then I get to that chapter and I wrote in green ink above it, Our. Now, I didn't know that it was the name of Bernie Sanders' PAC, just so you know. It's my phrase, Our Revolution. And I'm finishing the book, and a friend of mine walks in, where I'm away for the weekend with a friend, and she walks into the room and she says, have you thought any more? I was literally finishing the book. And she said, I said, Victoria, I'm finishing the book. And she said, have you thought any more about a title? And I said, what do you think of Our Revolution? And I burst into tears and she burst into tears. And we realized that I realized it's the title and she realized. And it's the revolution each of us has in our individual lives. It's the revolution that the two of us have in our relationship, from a certain kind of mother-daughter relationship to what I call the third stage of a mother-daughter relationship, where you're women together. And it's also our revolution of that time, because that was the era of, the Chicago Convention and, marches and MOB and all of that.
Movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement.
And the peace movement, yeah.
For many of us, our transition to adulthood, or those of us who are of your generation, and for younger women, I can't think of a book that accesses the 1950s and 60s in a more easy to absorb way through the eyes of these incredible preachers who were complicated but so appealing. This book has everything. It has class, race, sex. It's just an extraordinary read. And so now I think we're supposed to move to some questions that our folks at BookHampton are going to moderate for us. Thank you, Honor. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Leslie, we have these wonderful dinners where we go out, meet at the little restaurant, and most recently in the little restaurant in the
Historical Society, yeah.
All right. So we do have a few questions that have come in from our guests, and for anyone that has not sent in a question that they may have on mind, don't be shy, send it on over. We still do have time to collect some more before the end of the event tonight, but let's dive in. So one of our guests says, I'm curious to hear how Honor views this book now in context of the Black Lives Matter movement happening now. What are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are that I thought, thank God I wrote this book now, because I think it really points out some of the history of white people in the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, and also some of the history. For instance, Martin Luther King coming out against the war in Vietnam, which was a huge, scandal at the time. I mean, it was a time, and I just saw these people on the streets and I said, I wish my mother was alive. I wish both my parents were alive to see this, because the politics are the most beautiful part of the politics are analogous and are the same. I think that this is an American historical flow that, and John Lewis's death reminds us of that comes right up into the present. And I can only pray that, that just as the civil rights movement made certain changes happen, that this movement too will continue to change things. I mean, my mother would have just loved that mayor of Washington painting Black Lives Matter on the street in front of the White House. She would have been right down there. She was always going, to the next demonstration.
All right. What is your writing process? Is it the same for this book as it has been for past memoirs? And how long did it take you to write it?
Each book, there were aspects that are the same, but actually they're very different. And in this case, I had the technical task of weaving in my mother's writing without having it intrude. I didn't want to have quote marks, and I wanted it to all flow. So that was a big technical problem. Plus, I kept learning things about her and finding things about her. I found out that she not only was a friend of Dorothy Day of the Catholic Worker, but published her piece about the Chicago Convention in the Catholic Worker. So there were little things. So my writing process, it was very difficult in the sense that I thought I would never finish. And I had so many plates in the sky. It took 7 years. The White Blackbird took 12. The Bishop's Daughter took like 4. So my process, as early in the morning as possible, sit down and try to keep order. And I was also teaching and editing an anthology of second wave feminist writings for the Library of America. So which ended up being great for this book, but it was a nightmare to have that much work. But so I love this book very much. And I especially love that Norton gave it one of the great covers of contemporary letters, because it's really her spirit.
Yeah. Well, and that actually, so another question that we have, in all of your research that was conducted for this book, is there any one thing that you found most surprising? I know you just said that a lot of what you found with your mother, was that it? Was that the biggest part for you, or?
Two different kinds of things. One was that I didn't know she had started writing as a child. And though I had seen her childhood poems, I didn't realize how good they were. In other words, she was someone who really started as a writer. She was a writer. And I also weave in some of her college fiction, which was wonderful. And that surprised me. And so actually, and then she made these amazing scrapbooks. So I started to have a different attitude toward her narrative energy, if you want to put it that way. Maybe the most surprising thing was this thing that Catherine Skipper, now deceased, but then aged 95, told me about going out to the movies with my mother and hanging out with at a bar afterward, and almost getting picked up for soliciting and talking so long into the night they had to take a late bus. And so they get back very late, and they live across the street from each other. And she just, when my mother goes to the door, she runs across the street, and she said that a friend of hers had said, "You never should have taken Mrs. Moore out to that bar and to the movies." And Catherine said, "Well, we wanted to hang out, and we did." And then she said, as she went away, he's not going to beat her, but it was like this vision of a different kind of husband who might have beat his wife for staying out late. So that was a kind of shocking and interesting thing. And You know, I am sure that there are a lot of sort of great Jenny Moore stories that I don't have in the book. I mean, one is my sister, this guy named Malcolm Boyd, who was a radical Episcopal priest, came to stay, and he was going to the Pentagon demonstration. And my mother said to my sister, who was, you know, 16 at the time, "So do you want to go to the demonstration, a Pentagon demonstration with Father Boyd?" "Sure." And my mother said, "Well, you might get arrested." And my sister said, "No problem." And went off to the demonstration and did get arrested. So.
Oh. Honor, what is next for you? Are you working on a new book now?
Well, I've just finished the edits on this Library of America anthology called Women's Liberation, Feminist Writings That Inspired a Revolution and Still Can, which begins with Betty Friedan and ends with Susan Faludi, and is very diverse and energetic, and really is about the writings out of the activism. No poetry, no fiction. And you know, 90 writers, head notes and introduction, and photo insert and captions for anyway, it's in the can, as they say, and will be out next March in time for Women's History Month. And I think it's going to be a kind of revelation for people who think they know all about second wave feminism.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
All right. We're going to take our last question now, which is, what books do you recommend? So what's your top list for reading?
Well, if you haven't read To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, you should read it. And what else have I read recently? I've just been reading these feminist. You might take a look at Adrienne Rich's book about motherhood, Of Woman Born, Motherhood as Experience and Institution. I love Margot Jefferson's memoir, Negro Land. We're sort of the same age. It covers sort of the same era, and we're great friends, and they're different, but I think they speak to each other in a way, the two books. You can read my poems as well. Is that sufficient, questioner?
That's great. And we're just, again, so absolutely honored to have you and Ellen with us to share in a conversation about your new book, which is absolutely moving. If you all have not gotten a chance to read it yet, pick it up, hug it, cuddle up at home, and just turn the pages.
Give it to your friends.
Yes.
This is Ellen, and I just want to say that somehow, in a way that I've never happened to me before, I've lost the video. I don't know if you have me on video, but I don't have you.
We do. We have you.
Oh, great. Well, I'm so sorry then if I was kind of fumbling around. Neither Matt nor I can figure out, but I just want to tell everybody that this is a great gift book as well as something to read yourself. It's about mothers and daughters and so much more in terms of our own history. And I think a great book to give to our own daughters so that they understand a little bit better who we are, because there's a little bit of all of us in it, as exceptional and unusual as the Moore story turns out to be. It's just also a beautiful read, as I said, novelistic in its reach.
Ellen, thank you.
So thanks, Honor, and thanks to all of you for being here.
Yes, thanks so much for coming, really.
Thank you, guys. And yes, thank you to our wonderful guests for tuning in today, joining in on the conversation, sending in your questions. And as always, thank you for supporting your local independent bookstores. We could not do this or be here without you. Our Revolution by Honor Moore can be purchased at BookHampton.com, rjjulia.com, by calling in or visiting us in store, whatever you're most comfortable with. Signed book plates are available while supplies last, so get your copies. Happy reading all, and have a great night. Good night.
Thank you all.